I want to begin by acknowledging that our gathering tonight is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Shinaapi people. This is their traditional homeland. Those nations lived here long before Europeans arrived. We want to acknowledge the teachings, past and present, and acknowledge that they still live side by side with us today. Talking about journeys, the journey for the Drumble and District Heritage Society with Mr. Tony Beresford here began when Tony showed up at the museum one day and said, I have a donation. And he met with Dawn, and Dawn and him got talking. And Dawn's great. Dawn's always looking for speakers for us. And Dawn probes and finds out what people know and finds people that would be interesting and would be great potential speakers for us. And they had a great conversation. And Dawn came away with that saying, we've got someone who's got a vast wealth of knowledge about war and war history, and would make a great presentation and presenter for us. So that brought Tony to us. We appreciate the fact that you're here tonight and you're giving him your time and your knowledge. That can't be understated how valuable that is. We look forward to your presentation, and on behalf of everyone, we'd like to welcome you here tonight.
Yeah, try to do this with the microphone. Maybe just short. I'm not that tall. Just slightly over the minimum requirement to join in World War I. Shorter than me. When I joined cadets, I was 5'4". So you had to be big enough to join cadets back in the day to wear the uniform. So if you weren't big enough, you couldn't join. So basically in the Army it was the same thing. So if you were under 5'3", they wouldn't let you join the Army during the First War to begin with, until they raised what they call bantam battalions, which were guys that were shorter. They had to be 4'10" to 5'4". Anyways, trivia. Might be a test on this app. So anyways, we'll just get going. I'm doing this from the perspective of a sergeant, because that's who I was, that's what I was in the Army. There's all sorts of history books out there. There's awesome history books. There's going to be a lot of things that I've plagiarized in this. So all the resources are actually, there's a memory stick, and anything I used pretty much is on that memory stick in PDF format. So if you go back to the museum later on, you can go look it up on that format. But anyways, what I tried to do is focus this one on the local area. So I've been dealing with the World War I history stuff basically since CFB Borden had their 100th anniversary in 2016. And I was still posted to the base back then. And they asked me for my input for some of the projects that you'll see at the end of the PowerPoint. I was an instructor for technicians. I was a fire control systems technician for 20 years in the Army. I was also, before that, an aircraft electrician for 6 years in the Air Force, and then I started off in the Navy Reserve as a boatman. So I'm one of those few rare people that actually did the tri-service and tried everything. So, I'm trying, right? So I ended up, I started in cadets, actually it would be 50 years ago this year, and coming up. So that's when I started doing the bugling with the cadet band, and I still bugle for all the veteran programs, like for Remembrance Day and D-Day. We just did it in Barrie on Sunday for all the commemoratives through the year. So anyways, that's why I still have this thing going on with the history. I've been out of the service since 2018. I fully retired from the public service. So now I just work as a volunteer down at our local town archives in Mississauga Beach. And I'm doing local history on the ship that was named after our town, which was HMCS Mississauga, who was one of the minesweepers that went into D-Day and cleared the routes into Omaha Beach, which is what they call Bloody Omaha, the one that didn't quite work the way it was supposed to. So if you ever get a chance to watch the movie Big Red One, or The Longest Day, you'll see all the stuff that's going on the shores. Well, the minesweepers were the guys that went in first, cleared the lanes, and didn't get caught, which was the amazing part. So it wasn't until the destroyers were actually pulling up, the sun was coming up, that they finally, the Germans realized, wait a minute, there's somebody out there. So by then the minesweepers had already done their job and got almost everything cleared. So anyways, so we'll get on from that. So before I start, safety statement, because we do this in the military all the time. All these weapons have been cleared because I made sure they were with Don when I came in. They're all deactivated. The barrels are actually drilled out in the pin, so none of these weapons can fire. The same with the shell kit back here. This is totally deactivated. It's empty, and there's nothing inside other than just the plunger moving back and forth. So I can show that if anybody wants to see it afterwards. But it's safe. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to do that right now. So, okay, so safety first. Every time you hold any of these weapons, they're still weapons even if they're not activated. As soon as I put a bayonet on the end of it, it's still a weapon. Right? Excellent. So before we get started tonight, I thought it'd be appropriate, since it is D-Day today, that if you don't mind, we'll do the last post and a reveille. Basically, what the last post is all about is back in the old days, we used to use bugles for giving all the orders on the camps. And you got to remember, back in the First War, there was no big honking PA systems around like we have today. They were just getting them invented. So the bugle was still used for a lot of the duty calls during the day, or if you were with a Highland regiment, they'd use the bagpipes instead. So you'll notice in the Legion, sometimes everybody stands to attention when the bagpipes are playing. Well, they're only supposed to do that during duty calls, which are, you know, the regimental march past and certain calls during the day. So it's not every time the bagpipes play. Sometimes it's just a song. So the same with the bugles is you don't come to attention every time a bugle plays. You only come to attention when it's a duty call. So I'm going to do the 2 duty calls last post. So last post was generally the one they played at the end of the day after all the soldiers have been put into their places for the night and put into positions for doing lookouts and all that stuff. And they would play last post. And so it comes to us now with our history for Remembrance Day that we use it to put the soldier into what they call the sitting sentry. So basically he's passed. And then when he wakes up into heaven, then we play the reveille. Right? So that's how it goes with this. So you can't lament somebody until after they've left. Bagpipes come after. So anyways, if you can stand, please. Not do it in the microphone. Okay, I'll go off to the side a little bit so I'm not going people's eardrums. So just out of curiosity, anybody have any relatives that actually fought at Vimy Ridge or D-Day in the audience today? Would you mind saying something about them, if you could, who they were to you?
I'm not sure. Well, he was I've got his battalion. I actually got his bracelet.
Okay.
It was my great uncle. And
It's for the rank.
well, they did all the battalions of Canadian divisions all
Yeah.
go there and fought.
Yes.
So ever just put anybody, Canadian soldier, who fought.
In the first war, yeah. Except for all the ones that were in waiting, coming over to fill in. Well, I'll get to that in a little bit. Yourself?
My husband's relative was J.C. McCurry, the last Chief Justice of Ontario.
Oh, wow. Okay. And yourself? Oh. Well, there's maybe in D-Day, because that's what I was asking about
Oh,
D-Day too.
D-Day.
Yeah, 'cause today's D-Day.
My uncle
Yeah.
who landed on the beach on D-Day. He sheltered for the night behind a large pile of something. In the morning, it was ammunition.
It's hot.
And I have true relative, well, my father-in-law who passed away.
Yeah.
He was in the Navy. He was on the Canadian, they were throwing shells.
Mhm.
And my uncle, he was a dispatcher, and he was what I guess they call D-Day 2.
Okay.
He was in the second wave.
Okay, yeah, D-Day plus 2.
Plus two. Does that mean the second day? Or
Yeah, second day.
Oh,
So,
sorry, second
so
day.
D-Day's the departure day. And H-hour was the time where the airborne forces landed. So H-hour came before the troops actually landed on D-Day. But they'll talk about D-Day minus also. So the minesweepers and all that stuff left on D-Day minus one and went out in the middle of the night and started. But the clock had stopped because the weather was so bad. And then they had to restart the clock again. So D-Day itself wasn't supposed to be, that's the day, 6th of June, it was the day that we start. So the departure date will now be the 6th of June, because the weather's finally calmed down, right?
So if you had a Navy dispatcher, they would meet him the first day.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Because he had a motorcycle and all that. And actually, there's a film of him
Oh, yeah.
in an aircraft.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you for sharing it. And anyways, I just wanted to do a tie-in with what's going on today and, the actual day and why I'm here doing this. How I got here was a friend who shall not be named found this bugle, and because I'm a bugler, he says, hey, you could probably use this better than me, you'll find a good home for it. So I ended up doing the research on it. It's not playable in the condition that it is now. It looks really good, it's more like a presentation piece. So as I was looking at the details on it, I saw that it was marked for 7th Company 38 Branch. So I'm like, well, that's peculiar, because when you go to do the history on the Brant Regiment, the 38 Branch, this is before the First World War now, there was only one short period of time when there was a 7 Company, and it was in Drumbo, right? And then they renumbered it because one of the other companies ended up getting shut down, forever, not enough people, whatever the reason was. So they got shifted over to being the 6th. So this can only be from Drumbo, right? So Princeton also had a company at the same time. I think they were number 5 company, if I remember. I'll have to go look it up again. So, and then the anomaly though is that the maker of this bugle didn't start producing them until after the company was gone. So that leads me to believe that it was a presentation bugle, probably for the 25th anniversary or something like that. And Don and I were talking about it, and most likely from the Fenian raids, probably 25th after the Fenian raids is what we kind of came up with the date where it's kind of sitting at. So anyways, I figured it belonged here, not but the pattern, what they call that, is a 1885 pattern bugle, so it's, or sorry, 1858 pattern, sorry, I'm a little dyslexic. And they used it during the Crimean Wars when they came up with that pattern bugle, which was like the Charged Light Brigade. So in my family history, I'm 9th generation military, so I can go all the way back to the Battle of Waterloo with my family line on my dad's side. So for me, this isn't history, this is family history in many ways. Anyways, we'll move on before I put everybody to sleep. Oh, just in case you saw, there's actual words for last post. They do exist. So it's not tabs, it's last post. Anyways, yada yada yada, me, I'm short, and I was in. Just a quick thing, I started my historian side of the military history stuff. I was one of the first, well, we were the first summer student guard at Fort Malden, so we were the trial that they did. And it worked that well with the summer with 4 of us, they started doing it as a regular thing. So we weren't the summer student guard, we were the guys before the summer student guard. Right? Sort of like that, with the beta version. I ended up doing basically the same thing for whatever service I've been in, so I ended up with the Sea Cadets. I worked on the HMCS Haida for 2 summers, and that's where I learned my trade as a bosun. And back then the cadet program used to teach you reserve level training, so when I went to go to the Navy Reserve, like, here's your first strike, you already know what you're doing, get to work. So that skipped me about 2 years ahead, which is like that, because of the time I did with the cadet program. Afterwards I went to go to the Navy. I wanted to be a hull technician, but they were short of those, or not short, it was closed at the time, I should say. So they came up with this thing called POET. So everybody's going to be like, what's a POET? So basically it was electronics training that was common for everybody that took electronics, and then once you got to the end of the course, then they'd figure out what trade you were going into. So it was kind of a little bit of a training for, so if you were going to get a good trade or not. So I lucked out and I got aircraft electrician at the end of it. It was supposed to be heavy radar to start with, which is like those radar sites that are way up north. So I was like, oh, yeah, I want to be radar. Went back to college, took robotics down in Windsor, and ended up with the militia down in Windsor, Service Battalion, and switched over to the Army, and then I was fire control systems in the Army. So basically, it's all the systems that have to do with all the targeting systems on the guns, targeting systems on the armored vehicles, all the turret controls, everything that's electronic, everything but toasters and radios. So yeah, pretty much. Oh yeah, and my ribbons are mine, I'm not wearing somebody else's. My rank, my ribbons. So, back to the beginning. So, Militia District number 2. So, Militia District number 2, I don't know if you can see it very well there. The borderline pretty near runs right near where you guys are. So anybody that was west of you ended up in Militia District number 1 going to London. So that's where the Oxfords ended up going. And because you guys are on this side, you ended up going to the Brants. Right? Back then, all the training pretty much was done at Niagara Falls, at Niagara-on-the-Lake, at the old grounds around Fort George, which they've been doing since the War of 1812. So unfortunately, the garrison grounds there were not the best suited for a modern army to be training in. So as you can see down at the bottom right, where that shell casing is in the way now, the barracks at Niagara-on-the-Lake hadn't really much changed since the time they were Fort George. So Sir Frederick William Borden, so it's not the Prime Minister Borden, it's Robert Borden was the Prime Minister afterwards. Frederick William Borden's the one that Camp Borden's named after. So anyways, he said, okay, this isn't working, we need to build a new training area, much larger, big enough to put a full division in for training. So they shopped around and they saw all this wonderful prime farmland, which it wasn't. So this is outside of Barrie in a village called Angus, and the township's called Essa. So logging was really big up there back then. And the problem here is that this was a big hunk of the sand plain that had all these big tall timbers on it, the pine trees, right? So once they logged all the pine trees out of there, the old growth forest, nothing was there to hold the ground down anymore. So the Army's thinking, well, that's great, we can get it at a deal. So for $47,000, they get to own all the property that's in Essa Township where C.P. Borden is. Right? However, 2 things happened. One, the members of Parliament that were around Niagara-on-the-Lake didn't think that was a great idea because they wanted all that money from the summer training going into their camp. And the other thing is that there was the property developer guys, they ran out there and started buying up all the property. So the government said, this isn't going to happen, we're changing the plan. So they put it on the back burner, and basically they just started kind of piecemealing it together in the back end up until 1915. So as the wars start to progress, things are getting worse, right? So just to give you an idea of what it's like standing around in a sand plane with a bunch of dust and everything else. Sir Sam Hughes, the Minister of Defense at the time, had started off with not Fenian Raids, sorry, out west with the Riel Rebellion. So he had been in the army during the Riel Rebellion, which was wearing uniforms not much different than what they were wearing during the Fenian Raids, which is what this Queen's Own Rifles uniform is here. But you'll see the difference between what the British used to wear and what we were wearing already by this point, as we were getting away from the scarlet tunics. So the rifle regiments, the ranger regiments, they all were wearing the green. And this is the same color green that our Canadian forces wear on the dress uniform today. It's forest green. So we still keep that as part of our heritage now. We do have the scarlet uniforms for the infantry and stuff like that for a ceremonial purpose. We're not using them on the parade anymore, like in battle anymore. But every battle's uniform becomes the next garrison uniform as they improve the uniforms, right? So next one around is the Boer War. So Boer War 1902, and what they're wearing actually is the same uniform as the guy on the left, but it was the tropical dress uniform, so it was white. But they thought white wasn't going to work very well while they were in South Africa, so they dyed it with tea, so that way it would be able to go in with the grasslands that were all around where they were fighting. Because standing out there with white tunics was just as bad as standing around with red tunics. Right? So by the time we hit the beginning of World War I, we're wearing basically what I'm wearing here right now, right? So all the accoutrements are still leather. It's all leather belts, right? Even the, things for your canteen were made out of leather. So the problem with leather is that it doesn't take the environment very well as far as rain and muck and everything else that they were starting to run into in these trench battles. Right? So as you can see the evolution by the time you hit 1918, that 1918 soldier looks a heck of a lot like what the soldiers looked like at the beginning of World War II. Right? And by the time World War II came rolling around, we were still wearing this as a garrison uniform, and the battle dress was for battle. Right? So this is what they switched to, battle dress. So this is what they would have been wearing going into D-Day. So you can see it's a lot different cut. Basically what it is they took a pair of coveralls, cut them in half, so you got the trousers and the jacket, but they actually button together in the middle, so you can actually make them into one piece. So definitely superior to this, but it's still wool. And wool and wet. Good for some things, not for other things. So, anyways, afterwards you can all come up and see the stuff. So, 1914. We didn't have a choice to go to war because we were part of the Commonwealth, and back then we still didn't have our Constitution brought home to us yet. We had to do what Britain said. So when they raised the troops initially, all the initial troops that we raised all went into the British Army as regiments within the British Army, fully under British command, and all the errors that went along with it. Right? So one of the first things they did is they passed the New War Measures Act, and then they basically ran around and found out any of the enemy aliens that were around. There was basically 80,000 of them that they interviewed, and they ended up interning 8,500 of them. And it was mostly Ukrainians, like myself and Mr. Mitchell. I think we're 10th cousins because it's on my mom's side. So they called for the army, right? So they could have just raised the militia and activated them all, but instead of doing that, they decided what they were going to do is raise a whole separate army that was using the militia units as the recruiting bases and the initial training. So these were totally brand new soldiers. And the reason is because Sam Hughes thought that the civilian would make a better soldier than the career soldier would. Sam Hughes is a little eccentric now. We're going to get into some of that a little bit later. So anyways, he looks for his 25,000 volunteers. They go off to the new camp at Valcartier. If you go into, there's one of the resources I got in there, and it's all about the scandals of the government during World War I, right? And Camp Valcartier would be one of them, and Camp Borden was actually considered one too. The Army already had bases, why are you building extra bases? Is what basically they started off with in the beginning. It wasn't until later they needed these things. So was he a visionary? Or did he just have friends? He needed to make money. So there was a lot of arguments on that. So anyways, they ended up shipping. So yeah, they got 33,000 recruited, 30,000 went over. So basically the other 3,000 roughly are the ones that were either flat-footed or were too ill by the time they were done training with them. Injured, whatever reason, they were weeded out as not being serviceable for going overseas. So like I said, they became part of the British Army. If you looked at a soldier back then, everything, the recruiting, the whole 9 yards was all, might as well have just been in the British Army, right? So see, I don't know if you can read the pay scale on the side there. So I was doing pretty good. I was making $1.35 a day. I think it's 25, 30, 35. 135. If you're married, then separation allowance came out of your pay. So the 20 bucks would go to your wife a month. A month. That's a lot of money back then, though, right? So now you got to think about that. So $1.35 a day for me because I'm getting extra responsibilities, right? So when you see the prices, the bases and all that stuff, $44,000 doesn't seem like a heck of a lot today. I mean, you wouldn't be able to buy a swimming pool probably for your house if you wanted to, right? And a deck for $44,000 bucks, right? So, yeah, you'll see it's going to get. So, like I said, a lot of the efforts that were going on were being done in the militia district. So in this area, 38th Dunford, which renamed themselves from being the Brants. 22nd Oxfords over in Woodstock. They became some of the hubs for recruiting the troops, and they started raising battalions, what they call the overseas battalions. So, the target originally was 50,000 by 1915, but they already switched it up to 150,000 because of the massacres that were going on the front lines. Basically, the Germans had swung their way through Belgium and across France, and then got held up just short of getting into Paris. So, and then everybody dug in. And then basically it was a static war for the longest time along there. Any gains that you made were usually lost within a counterattack within a day or two. So it was pretty brutal. So Sir Robert Borden, the Prime Minister at the time, by that point, he was shocked when he went overseas and saw what was going on, and meeting troops in the hospitals and all that stuff. And some of them, I mean, they had life-altering injuries, the amputations and all that. So he said that we're going to raise an army of 500,000 when we only had 8 million people in the whole country. So if you figure that in your family unit of grandma, grandpa, mom and dad, and your brothers and sisters, so by the time you go through the list, that usually meant that dad, brothers, right, are not around anymore. Maybe even grandpa if he was trained enough that he could still use them. So that's a pretty big chunk of the population. Almost everybody had somebody in the service, right? Or specifically war essential. So the early recruiting was going pretty well. However, as it started sliding into the second year, things were getting a little bit hard to get all the recruits. So then they started doing the strong arm version of recruiting, which was, how come you're still here? Right? You look pretty healthy. What are you doing on the streets here? So they were basically doing that. So they got up to 330,000 doing it the hard way, of just having volunteers coming in. It wasn't until 1917 where they actually introduced the conscription. And that's where they actually said if you're within this age and this age, you got no other reason, you're in the Army. So during the first phase of recruiting, as far as the native side of the world went, they weren't specifically going recruiting for natives. So if you showed up, that's great because of the treaty status and all that stuff. They couldn't actually go in and say, we're recruiting you. However, as the war progressed, they had requests that actually came from the natives, and there was actually 2 battalions that were raised. One out in Saskatchewan, and the 114th. The Brock's Rangers were the only 2 battalions that were totally indigenous. They did a little better, at least they got into the fighting. Sorry. Said a little dyslexic sometimes. So, like I said, by the second phase, now they're starting to recruit, and recruit big time. And you'll find a lot of the infantry regiments even today, a lot of the guys that are in reconnaissance and all that stuff are usually coming from the native side of the world. We learned our tactics from the way that they fought during the War of 1812, and we just keep adapting it as we're going along. So, lessons learned by 1915, gas attacks. So the 1st Canadian Division, the first ones that went over, they got into the second battle of Ypres, and they suffered 6,000 casualties and change. Plus the PPCLI lost another 678. So that's when they decided to get rid of the Ross rifle. So the Ross rifle, I was mentioning earlier, was a very effective range rifle. So if you're on a target shooting at Connaught Ranges outside of Ottawa, super rifle, which is where the headquarters is, right? So they're all like, oh, this is a great rifle. However, it doesn't work in the muck, right? So you could have the best target rifle in the world, but if it doesn't chamber around, it's useless. Might as well be beating them with the wood stick. So they replaced it with, originally they were grabbing the #1 Mark III Enfields from the British soldiers that had fallen, and they started turning them, using them for themselves instead of using the Rosses. And then eventually the Canadian Army said, okay, fine, we're going to replace the rifle. So, and then they went to this one. So I'll show you later what the weight is if anybody wants to come and feel it, but just trust me that it's not light. Right? And this is not fully loaded either. But the worst thing about that was the gas attack. So this is the first time they actually used gas against troops. So luckily for us, I think it was in the PPCLI, one of the guys happened to be a miner before, and he said, hey, it's chlorine, because he recognized it from when he was working. And he says, everybody, you pee into your handkerchief. So you'll hear stories in there saying about, oh, put water on it, they're just, no. Originally it was the urine into the handkerchiefs, and because that's all they really had on them. And they were breathing through those. So the early gas masks were pretty rudimentary. You'll see they look like hoods, and basically they're just impregnated cloth. Second lesson learned. Organization. Okay, so first battalion goes over, then was followed by the first division goes over, followed by the second division. When the second division goes overseas, we can arrange to have the Canadian Corps. So that now we have more than one division, so you can have a corps. Normally there's 3 divisions in a corps, but 2 is good enough. So, but they're already raising other corps in England and on the way coming. So, 2nd Canadian Division, they got hit at, they were along the Messina Ridge, right outside of Passchendaele, which is where the uniform is from, the movie. So they were around an area called St. Eloi, and the craters that you see in the photograph were actually planned. They went in, blew up under the ground underneath the German lines, but the craters were so big that they actually started to become lakes, which meant the troops that were supposed to be taking the position where those trench lines were ended up having to go fight their way through the massive craters that were left there. To the point where they're actually, they could see the enemy on the other side of the crater, and the enemy's running around one side, and they're chasing them around the other side. It got so bad. Right? And the problem was the Canadian Corps, the troop commanders on the ground didn't know where their troops were anymore because they all got jumbled around within all these craters. So when they were calling in fire to take out the enemy, sometimes it was their own guys getting hit. A lot of bad things going on. So by the time they were done with this one, another 1,378 were wounded or dead. So Communication, got to be able to talk to each other. Organization. So, the Canadian Corps got passed over to General Byng. And General Byng was actually a very organized, very thoughtful officer, to the point where the troops started to call themselves the Byng Boys because they liked working for him so good. And he started seeing how the things were going in the battles, and he didn't like the way the troops were being massacred by blowing the whistle and having everybody running across the open field and getting machine gunned down. It just wasn't on. So they were trying to figure out how they're going to fix this. Same thing with the artillery. There's pictures of General McNaughton. During the First War, he was the general of the artillery. By the time the Second War came around, D-Day, he's the general of the Canadian Army. And you'll never see him smiling in any of his pictures, because he felt every single guy that died out there, it was in his head. And he didn't want to see that happen again. So, he started doing a bunch of reforms, training their tactical training. So up until then, while we're training in Canada, we were still training to the old British system, which was still training to the old thin red line, right? So basically, blow the whistle, everybody attack, with bayonets fixed, off you go, right? And not working in a mechanized war. The machine guns, like the one across the hallway over there, just mow you down. They didn't care what they were doing over there. So, and it was on both sides. So actually, here's a picture of General Byng. He's inspecting one of the German guns, because he's trying to see if there's any modifications that have been done to them that can help his guns. So planning, third division was shattered at Mount Sorel. Okay, so this is an Ypres. So this is the only time that the Canadian guns had ever been captured by the Germans during that war. So up until then, we've been capturing their guns, but they hadn't been capturing our guns. The Canadians became a professional army at what they call counter battery fire. So basically spotting the enemy guns and taking them out before they can take your guns out. Right? So, the problem was they lost those guns. They were taken back. But basically, at the end of the day, once everything was done, they actually hadn't gained any ground at all. Nobody gained any ground. Everything was back to status quo again. So for that, we lost 8,500 of either wounded or killed or missing. You think about 8,500 in a town this size, right? That's pretty much about half your town, maybe the whole town. Right. Think about that. You guys are about that size now. Yeah. So that's a lot to lose in a day. So, because of all this, there's a lot of political pressure going on. They want the Canadians to be under their own command. They don't want the British to be in charge of this anymore. They want us to be given a task and let us do our own task. However, Sam Hughes, being the guy that he was, he's still trying to do damage control, so he's running around. He says, Camp Borden will fix everything. I'm going to build my dream base on there, right? Because it's just like a fresh slate, right? Well, it's fresh sand, right? A lot of tree stumps. Build a new base there. Okay. So, they decided that's where they're going to build it. And he was a teetotaler, right? So basically there wasn't a pub within 180 miles of the camp until they built the camp. Right? Then Angus had its own reputation. So that's basically the train that they walked into and started having to build. So what you see in the background is where they're getting ready to put the first of the artesian wells into the ground. So it wasn't a bad property for a couple of reasons. One, lots of fresh water. All sorts of sand points, right? And the other thing is 2 major railway lines ran near it. So because of that, transportation was good. So they could get all the supplies that they needed, they could get the troops moved out to the coast. Right? Boom. So the preferred contractor of the Canadian government that was used happened to be one of Sir Sam Hughes' honorary colonel buddies that he'd appointed. Yeah, and then they got the 157th Simcoe Foresters, these guys, who happened to be the guys that cut down the trees to begin with to build the camp, right? Because most of those were lumberjacks working up around Victoria Harbour after Borden got jacked out all the trees. Right? So as soon as they got the property, they followed up on May the 16th, so I got to watch this timeline a little bit now. So May 16, 2016. Okay? New base was given the nickname of Camp Horror because the sand was everywhere, like up your nose, everywhere you go. And there wasn't enough water on them at the time when they were still working, so they're trying to hack and chop all this stuff out. However, they brought it up to full strength within 6 weeks, and that included the 114th, the 125th, and the 168th battalions that just came from around here. So the 168th from Oxford wasn't real happy because they just got moved from London, and London had a pretty decent camp there. So anyways, they initially raised this massive tent city, so all the other infrastructure wasn't in place yet. It was just for the troops that were there starting to build the camp. After the initial cost for the land, $300,000 for all of half Asset Township, right? 20 square miles. By the end of the year, the development cost was $1.2 million, which in those days, I mean, you got to add like 3 more zeros onto that, right? To just give you a ballpark figure of what kind of cost we're talking. And a lot of it went to the preferred contractor of the government of Canada, as he's busy building all this. So they did do some good stuff though. So the main drag through the middle of the camp street is about ½ kilometers roughly. They had 150 street lamps, which was a pretty big deal back then when a lot of times we didn't have any. Say 24 kilometers of wrought iron water mains, which I remember they were replacing when I was posted there, because they're starting to finally collapse after almost 100 years. When you think about some cities around, they've got water mains that are older than that. Permanent buildings, so they started building. Initially, there were wooden building structures that they were putting along, and then they came up with this thing called gunite, which is basically, you guys ever have one of them sprayed swimming pools? You know, and they go in and they spray all the side in with the cement. That's basically what they do with these buildings. They just spray the whole building with cement. Ta-da! That's a cement building, right? And then the ones that they did put the cement on, they used what they call rubberoid, which was basically artificial shingle roof. So it's tar paper, right? So they just covered the rest with tar paper. But they did build a lot of good training spaces on there, so they got the parade grounds finally after a while, where the grass started to grow again. But they were still basically living outdoors because most of the troops lived in tents. It was just the kitchens and the washrooms and stuff that were all permanent buildings, headquarters buildings, officers' messes, you know, things like that. So anyways, the troops were still training, basically old school. As you can see, the guys that are doing the bayonet approach on the left there, the bottom. Difference though now is they're bringing instructors back from overseas that have been wounded overseas. So a lot of senior NCOs and officers. So if you look at the fellow that's throwing the hand grenade on the far right side there, if you look at his face and it looks kind of blurry on there, it's because it's not blurry. That's actually what his face looks like, because he got it half shot off. That's how he's healed up. But, you know, if you take safety briefings, the best guy to give you the safety briefing is the guy that hurt himself, right? Remember, don't do this, right? So this was the revolutionary part of what they did in the camp, though. So this is actually Camp Hughes' out west, which was built after Borden was, but it's basically the same design for the trenches. So if you look on the left, you see the enemy trenches, where the enemy force stays, and then you'll see the attacking trenches on the right, which is the good guys, the blue force. Yeah, yes. Right. So, blue on red. So anyways, the trenches are all dug. You can see like this parallel line of trenches going across the middle. The front line is the attacking trenches. The back one behind is the communication trenches. And then they keep going all the way back into the support trenches. And then the communication lines that are running in between them. So this trench system, they built 11 miles worth of this type of trenches in Camp Borden, which is a lot of digging. Right. I'll show you what it looks like. So these are actually pictures from Camp Borden from one of the soldiers' albums. I can't remember the exact battalion he was with at the time. Like say, if I remember right, it's one of the ones that was raised in Toronto. So anyways, the whole point of these trench systems was after you did all your initial soldier training, they put you into the trench system to learn the trench routine. So what they would do is they put you into the defending trenches to start with and have the guys that have been there a little bit longer, they attack you for a while, and so you can learn how to defend yourself. And then after you've been in there about a week, they'd switch and they move the guys that were defending for a week into the attacking position, and they can practice all their patrolling and everything else. And the guys that are in the defending side start all over again with the cycle. So basically they're running each battalion through. They had 25 battalions that were in Borden at that time. Okay, so officially opened on the 11th of July. So we're gone from May to the 11th of July, and the camp's officially open. But they've already been training there. They've already been, doing all the camp build-up at the same time. But these guys are pretty tired. They're pretty dusty, right? So you might as well have a big parade, right? So all 25 battalions out on the big dusty square, and they're all marching around. So they had to do a practice the day before and then do the actual parade. So anyway, Sergeant William Murray of the 125th on Brent here, he said they were highly complimented on their parade. So they didn't have a break in the line, and Sir Sam Hughes was very impressed at the discipline that the troops had. And this comes up because some of the troops weren't so disciplined. So highly recommended for overseas. In fact, when they got overseas, they were one of the first battalions that they put into the new 5th Canadian Division that they were raising. Unfortunately, the whole 5th Canadian Division wasn't put together in time for the end of the war, and they broke it up at the end of 1917 and used those troops to disperse. Oh yeah, okay, so, had the big parade. But the problem was they had a riot after the parade, when they had the big parade. Okay? So on the Monday after they rehearsed, so this is why. They were given orders by Brigadier General Logie, who was the camp commander at the time, and he told the men not to carry their water bottles. Right? In July, in Borden, in the sand, with no trees. Right? So if any of you have been up there in the summertime, it's bad enough, it gets pretty hot there. There's a hot spot, like even today, the ambient temperature around Borden is always about 2 or 3 degrees higher than it is around the outside areas. So 20 men out of every battalion were knocked out, right? That's a lot. So the point where they were pretty upset, to the point where, there we go. The 157th Battalion, the guys that built the camp to start with, and the 177th were ordered out with bayonets fixed to put the rioters down. That's how bad the riot was. So there is some speculation that it could have been some of the bootlegging that was going on in Angus that had part of the problem, especially after they had been drinking water all day. So I don't know. But they're saying that it originated with some of the troops that came from London. So, graduation's done. The original troops that are doing well are starting to get moved overseas. Okay, so the ones that were deemed fit, the people that were in the battalions that were unfit for service, send them back home. The rest of the battalion, off you go onto the train. Train brings you to either Montreal, Quebec City, or Halifax. Board the ships, and across you go in convoy. Getting to lovely camps like this one. So, Sergeant Murray now says, seems hard for a fella after being in his own battalion and making all his pals and getting to know each other, watching each other's back basically, and then to have the battalion broken up when they get over there. So, he was transferred to the 1st Battalion of the CEF after Vimy, and he ended up getting wounded himself. So the 125th was selected for the 5th Canadian Division, and you'll see them listed on the right-hand side in the 3rd Brigade down. Sorry, my fuzzy eyes aren't working with the fuzzy lines.
Number 9.
Yeah, number 9. Yeah, so that's the that'd be the 13th Brigade. So each line there is a brigade, and each brigade, there's 3 brigades in the division. So basically each of those red squares, or maroon, I guess you'd call them this color, is basically 1,000 men, right? Roughly, of the upper ones. So yeah, so they're over strength divisions of 22 to 25,000 men. Okay. So, because of the problems with the control on the troops, because of the problems with the managing of the troops overseas while they're with the British control, basically Sir Robert Borden's government was forced to say, Sam Hughes, we got a problem with you, and I think we're going to finish it now. So they created this Ministry of Overseas Militia Forces, or military forces, which was now a department of the government that now is overseeing the troops that were overseas to make sure there's no extra expenditures and nepotism going on and all the rest of that stuff. Well, Hughes didn't like that. So he basically, depends on whose version you're reading, but basically along the line is he wrote a nasty letter back to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister said, your services are no longer required, out you go. So because of that, they started changing the way they're doing their day-to-day organization, the way that they're dealing with the British, the way that they're handling all the war scrap, all the movements for troops going back and forth, all the supplies and stocks, everything that they had to do. They were going away from the sole source contracting that was going on to getting at least 3 bids on contracts. So, 1916. By this point, Borden is talking to the United States now in New York because they hadn't entered the war yet. And he said, we in Canada are entirely masters of our own destiny, but it's just in the motherland where the hour struck that there was no wavering and no waiting. So in Canada, the decision was never for a moment in doubt. He said, our resolve is as fixed and unshaken today as it was first, and whatever loss or sacrifice we may still have to bear, we will not waver or falter. So basically what he's talking about is like, because we were kind of made to go into the war as opposed to volunteering to go into the war, having our own government decide like we did in World War II, right? World War I, we didn't have the choice to declare war ourselves, right? So the Americans were like, well, you know, you guys you're dealing with this, it's your own fault, right? And he's like, no, it's okay, we're good, we got it. So, 2.5 years, no end in sight, the trenches are all stuck. There's got to be a way to get out of there. So, new technology was costing so much lives because of the rapid firing weapons, and they were still using old tactics to respond to them. Right? So, Canadian Corps says, no, we can do this better. You give us a task, we'll take it, we'll do it ourselves. Right? So by this point, 250,000 troops are overseas at this point. Right? And this is basically what you were seeing when you got over there. No man's land. Kind of looks like Borden, actually, at that time. I think that's what he had in the back of his head, maybe. But you got to get to that point. So basically, everybody's starting to dig in. They're digging underground. So there's a lot of tunneling going on, not just for shelter from the overhead. By this point, we've gone from wearing this into battle, right? They adopted these helmets. And if you notice, they're not very good for shots coming this way because they were designed for shrapnel coming down from above, right? So as far as a tin hat for rocks falling on your head, this is perfect, right? But unfortunately, it wasn't rocks, and they were coming at all angles. So they still had to fix that. Vimy Ridge got captured at the beginning of the war. French and British had already tried taking it a number of times and failed every single time. So by this point, they're getting ready to do the whole mass attack around the Arras area. And so they gave the Canadians Vimy. They said, we'll take that. Your turn. Sorry. This one doesn't go backwards for some reason. So anyways, by this point, this is the size of the Canadian Army in the field under the Canadian Corps, right? So now you've got 4 Canadian divisions and a 5th waiting in the sidelines just in case, right? Plus all the support troops that you need to maintain that. So there's everything from our own railway to actually the Navy even had guns on the line. There was Navy infantry battalions that were right there. Not in the Canadian Navy, but in the British Navy, right? Our Navy was big enough back then. But that's how much they had to pull resources in to make sure they had what they needed on the ground in the house. So the Canadians said, okay, we're going to get smart about this now. So some of these technology changes were already around at the time, but they started using them differently. So for example, by this point the Air Force is starting to get pretty built up. The original aircraft though would have a pilot and an observer riding in it, so there'd be 2 people, right? And basically the observer was the important officer because he was an artillery trained officer, so usually an engineer, pretty smart fella, right? Whereas they considered the pilots to be basically bus drivers to get the observers out to the area. So the observer would make all his calculations up in the aircraft on a piece of paper, tie it to a note or a rock, and then they throw it out of the airplane, right? And hopefully it landed where it was supposed to go because the winds would pick it up sometimes. But it was supposed to go down to the lines that were on the ground, and the troops would pick it up, run to the signal station, and then send the gun corrections in so they can correct the way the guns are firing. So they figured out that that probably wasn't the most effective method. So what they ended up doing is they put the first, Vimy was the first battle where we actually used radios to do gun corrections. However, this is still an ultralight aircraft, and trying to put a radio that was the size of a human into there, and that it could only send. So the guy that was sending the gun corrections had no idea if anybody could even hear him. You know, if anybody's busy, if the guns moved, oh, I guess I got it right. You know, so. But it was still a heck of a lot better than trying to throw it out with a rock, right? Plus, they had really detailed maps because they started doing aerial photography. But the problem was they had also invented smoke to go across the battlefields to obscure the ground from the air. So the observers that were up originally in the balloons, before they got to the aircraft, couldn't see what was going on the other side. However, the guy that invented tear gas also invented an infrared filter for the cameras, so then you could see through the smoke. So they built, this is what we call a sand model, which also kind of looks like Borden. So they built a replica, a scale model of the battlefield for the senior commanders to come out and study, right? And then they built replicas of the trench lines in the back. So as they were reinforcing the battalions that were there, they'd bring them offline, the new ones would be going up, they would go into the back and they'd be practicing in the practice trenches with the new reinforcements that had just come over from Canada, who had also been trained in trench warfare. So because of that, these new battalions that were getting boosted, right, were all of a sudden a heck of a lot stronger than anything that they'd ever run into before, because before that it would have been the first time they got into the trenches, the first time they went into battle. So replacing that many when you're looking at about one in every 8 or every 10 guys, right, to have that many that are already able to fight, fit the fight, that's what you're looking for, right? So extensive tunneling system, talk about that later. troops to supply wounded. Before Vimy started, the Germans didn't know how many troops we had on the ground because they had actually built a whole bunch of, I'll show you in a minute. Anyway, a whole bunch of tunnels, so that all the troops are underneath the ground and hiding. So you'll see some things about Vimy where they, because it's all chalk underground there, the guys were actually carving all their battalion crests into the wall while they were waiting down there, listening to the artillery pounding in and everything. Right. So, 40,000 maps they made. This is back in the time when you'd be lucky if you got 20. You know? So 40,000 maps they made of the battlefield, distributed to all the company commanders, all the platoon commanders, all the senior NCOs. Everybody knew where they were going. So this is one thing, if anybody's ever been in the Army knows, Canadian Army likes to do a lot of O groups. Okay? So we call them organizational group meetings. So basically this is where we get called in and then everybody goes down the chain of command and gives all their orders about what's happening for the next week. Right? So we do this a lot. And this all goes back to this. Right? So because all the officers knew where they were going, all the senior NCOs knew where they were going, all the junior NCOs knew where they were going. So if any of those guys got killed, which was pretty highly likely, because the first guy out of the trench usually is the officer, right? Blowing a whistle, follow me, off he goes, right? Boom, he goes in. So who's coming up next? The sergeant on the right. Bang, he's taken out, right? So the next fellows that are following, they got to know where they're going, right? Because if they don't know where they're going, then the battle's going to fail. Difference between us and the British on this battle too. They gave the company commanders the latitude to be able to actually shift their troops and maneuver them. So maneuver basically is the ability to hold a position and swing around on it. So if you're getting flanked from one side or the other, somebody's attacking you from the sides, you can actually go and engage them, right? And still keep a watch on what's going forward at you too at the same time. But they gave them the ability to move instead of just keep moving forward and having your sides picked off all the way out like crows, right? Also, fire movement on the ground. The troops were learning how to do things like pepper potting and stuff like that. So this is where you start, move up, then another guy covers, well the other one moves up. So we're not running headlong into a battle anymore. And even if you see the way these guys are approaching right now, they're not going through big and wide, you're coming in single and narrow, right? As these sections going through. The other thing we did is we adopted back to 4 companies again. The British had gone to 3 companies in each battalion. So a company is roughly 90 men, right? So with the 4th company, what that meant was the 3 leading companies, the 2 are flanking on the flanks watching. Basically they're on the guard. The lead company is going through the objective, attacking. As soon as they grab the objective, they hold, and then the next company is coming up through behind, fresh troops, right? So they're passing through the guys that just took that trench and are holding it, and they're moving on to the next objective, right? So it's smart because all the tunnels that were under there, the Germans were doing the same thing. And what was happening was after it got plastered with artillery, you didn't know where the openings were anymore, and the guys would fight through, and the next thing you know, there's people popping up behind your back and shooting you in the back, right? So always watch your back. Got your 6, right? 6 o'clock. So actually that's where that term mop-up came from. It was for the troops that were taking care of mopping the floor after. Massive tunnels. So under each section you can see there's tunnels, they call them subways back then, the same thing. So 1,200 men, 1,000 men. Basically working on 12 different passageways. And so sometimes what the tunnels were for was to protect the troops. Sometimes they were to build their headquarters, command posts, that kind of stuff. Sometimes what they're doing was they would get to what's called the sap. And this is where the term sapper comes from, right? So the engineers would dig from a sap and they would run under the ground and then they would build a big cavern and fill it full of explosives, right? And put it underneath. So this came back from the days of the old castles, because they would try to do that, right? To knock the walls of the castles down. So basically it was the same concept. They said we can use that here too. So that's what we started doing. Artillery. John McNaughton, very smart fella. So he was an engineer by trade, and And he figured out that for every round of ammunition going through the barrels, he's putting so much wear on the barrels, right? After so long, you got to change the barrel, just like a hunting rifle, right? So what he said is, I can devise cables, and what we can do is we can adjust the sights for the amount of wear on the gun. So you just keep a record of all the rounds that are fired. We don't have to keep pulling the guns off the line, changing the barrels, and putting them back up on the line again. Now we can just adjust them from our sights, and that way the sights are more accurate, right? Because they're accurate, now the troops can follow closer to their artillery because they don't have to worry about getting hit by their own stuff anymore, right? So what they started doing is change the whole tactics of World War I doing this. So we created what was called a creeping barrage or a rolling barrage. And basically what it did was the rounds started stepping across the field. So first they pounded them for about a week just to get them like throw them off guard. And then they started with this rolling barrage and it started creeping across, like thunder across the field, right? And then the troops came up and they had 3 minutes to catch up. Because if you waited too long, then the enemy could pop up, right? Or even you get hit by your own artillery if you're going too fast, which is why the open serve was important. Timings, right? Either on time, because if you're not, either the enemy's going to kill you or you're going to get hit by your own stuff. So, counter battery fire too. They were developing basically seismic type sensors, so they could feel in the ground when the guns are firing, right? The big guns, it's just like having an earthquake. So they're also developing seismic registers, and they're developing better optics, so they can triangulate, so they needed to have like 2 observer posts a certain distance apart, usually like 100 meters or a kilometer, depending on what you're doing, and that way they could triangulate basically on where the enemy guns are firing from by looking for the blast, right? Yeah, so the creeping barrage, they're moving 90 meters forward every 3 minutes. So you got 3 minutes to catch up. Biggest technological change to the artillery though is changing this round. So on the end of this is from an 18-pounder gun. And this up here is the fuse, this part here. It unscrews. Right? Take it off, put another type on. So what they decided is they came up with this other one here, which actually had like a cap on the end of it. So when it fired, you hear that piece that's inside, that's getting pushed up with the gas inside, pushing it forward to arm the head on it, right? So these ones, they wouldn't explode until they actually physically hit some part, right? And then it exploded. These ones could hit the barbed wire and then explode. So some of the earlier battles had a problem because they were blasting the barbed wire fences with these artillery shells. They were leaving craters all over the place, and it was full of barbed wire, right? So that became a problem. So these new rounds could blast away the barbed wire aside and leave a space for the troops to pass through. This painting is actually from that engagement. So, 1,000 guns, basically hub to hub. Hub to hub, okay, not necessarily hub to hub, because you use a pay stick. So this is not just something cool that the Sergeant Major carries on parade. This is actually for measuring out the pace of how you're marching, so we can tell you how long it's going to take for troops to pass a certain distance. But they also use it for the artillery, back in the day, to pace out how far the guns were apart. Because every time you put a gun down, it's got to be surveyed in, right? So, because otherwise you'll be blowing up your own guys, and that's kind of bad. So, instead of surveying every single gun in, you're able to pace them off with a pace stick. So, Vimy ends up being one of the first big, basically what we call combat teams going in. It's supported by tanks, with the troops on the ground following up. The artillery's all out. Even the Navy's got their guns out there. The Air Force is doing their job with all their gun spotting where the troops are on the ground, where the enemy guns are firing from. Also, just telling how the battle's like pushing through. Right? So they have live feed of what's going on for the very first time of how the battle is. It's so effective. Okay. 15,000 men end up taking the German trenches. The German trenches were only defended with 8,000 troops plus 2,000 in reserve. So normally when we teach tactics in the army, if you're going to attack a force, usually you have to have 3 times the size of the force. So if there's a company in defense, then we have to send a battalion. If there's a battalion in defense, we got to send a regiment. If there's a regiment in defense, then we got to send a whole division, right? So it all scales up, right? 3 to 1, that gives you odds for winning. So in this case, they used technology as what we call a force multiplier. So basically, we didn't have to fight with a big, huge army because we fought smart, right? Because we fought the way we did, totally changed the way they're doing the trench warfare. So symbolically for Canada, though, basically we went from that to this. Well, not this fight because this didn't come till later. But you know what I'm saying? Like so back when they first joined, the Union Jack was a big thing, right? All the government buildings still flew the Union Jack. And you might see the Red Ensign, because the Red Ensign really didn't start getting developed until 1885 when the first ones first started coming out. And they just kept adding provinces to the shield, right? Until they decided to go with the 3 maple leafs instead, right? So, but this was strategic for Canada because it showed that not only could we be our own army to fight, but we could also be a successful army in the way that we're using the new technologies and everything. So we're not just colonial troops anymore. However, it came with a cost. 150,000 French and British troops had fallen there before, right? We ended up losing 3,500, okay? And 7,000 wounded. But compared to 150,000, I mean, in the big scale of the world, that was not, this was amazing. You send 15,000 troops in against a force that's almost the same size, and you take it in one day pretty well, right? And you only lost that much? Like, nobody believed it, right? So, like I said, still the bloodiest day in Canadian military history, so D-Day didn't lose that many troops. After that, starting actually from the Battle of the Somme really, but this is where that term storm troops came from, shock troops, right? They just couldn't believe what was happening. So anyways, as the war progresses, we start using all sorts of new technology, armored cars with machine guns mounted on them. They didn't have them, right? This is, while the troops were training in Borden, they were already working on this technology at that time. So the Armored Corps basically grew out of that. Borden was a really good training base because the Royal Flying Corps was out of there too, so they had aircraft around all the time after 1917. Right? So the troops that were coming out of there, even though it was not the nicest place to live, the training they were getting there was second to none. So I'm not going to talk about all the other battles of World War II because that's not why I'm here. There's lots of good books, and if you want to learn more about the Battle of Vimy, is Pierre Burton's book. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about what happened after, how we recognize our fallen, right? So, 1920, the Battlefields Commission came up, and they said we're going to build a monument. So they built the monument in Vimy Ridge. Basically, there was a big, pilgrimage that ended up going there in 1936. Wrong year. 26. Juggling the numbers again, sorry. Forget that one. I'll try to find it again after. Okay. I'm having a break. 1926, sorry. Okay, so. Yeah, Walter Seymour Allward designed this sculpture. Sorry it's not as good, showing up so good on here right now. The difference between this memorial and all the other, well not all the other ones, but most of the other war memorials that are in Europe is it was made to all the fallen and not just the Canadians. So this isn't specifically a Canadian monument, this is a monument to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, right? as opposed to where a lot of other regiments will build their own monuments and all that kind of stuff. So this isn't patting our back. This is saying, this is what we lost. All the fallen, right? The other 150,000 that they lost too. Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So we made the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It's at the foot of the National War Memorial in Ottawa. And this actually is a photograph of Nathan Cirillo. Anybody remember that incident? Yeah. So those are ceremonial rifles. They're pretty much what these things are, which is like wall hangers. You can't fire them. They're designed for parade purposes. These ones. So anyways, the fella came up on the right-hand side of that monument after he parked his car out behind it, and he came around and shot him in the back 3 times. And he did try to take cover behind the monument, but he just couldn't get over there in time. The other fellow on the right chased him with his rifle that didn't work. Right. So off he went, because Highlanders are Highlanders, right? And off he went. So anyways, he's originally from Hamilton, but he was with the Argyle and Sutherland Highlanders, which I believe is Brampton. So anyways, so the Unknown Soldier Monument and the War Memorial are for all of us. It's not just in battle. Camp Borden, so the province of Ontario, with the Heritage Trust, they've got their plant marker there now. If you want to know where that's at, if you're ever on the base, just look for the base fire hall. It's right across the street from the base fire hall. And actually they use that training, that building is still in use by the fire department for, what do you call it, respirator training. So it's basically doing what it was originally designed to do. It's the only Army building that's still standing. The Air Force will have some hanging only. They also, if I don't know if you can see it up in the right-hand corner there, put an arrow on it. So those training trenches still exist. They're underground, all the way from that triangle that says Vimy, all the way down to where the housing is on the right-hand side here. So this is all military housing now. But back during World War I, this area was all pastures and railway turnaround. That's why that loop is there, is from the original railway turnaround that used to be there. So they just kind of incorporated it into the roads when they were putting housing in. So anyways, the kids that go with those little trails out the back of their housing are right into the training trenches. So there's all sorts of bicycle paths and things that go over to what it says Trillium Trail. It's really hard to read it there right now. So Trillium Trail is actually a tank road they built in the Second World War, and they used it as a shortcut from where the tank hangars were to get them out into the training area along the old railway lines. So they cut right through the original World War I training trenches, which is good now because they paved the Trillium Trail. So if you want to go park there, you can take a walk along the Trillium Trail, and you're going to see this. So the original trenches are still there. Then you saw what they originally looked like, other than, you know, the wood's been removed and the other metal. The trench lines, you'll actually see the shapes of them going through the forest. So if you go to the right-hand side, there's like a mountain bike path that runs through it. It's easy to go through. It's about, I don't know, 200 meters up on the right-hand side. You start going up the trail. If you take the one to the left, it goes over towards the old campground where the restored piece is, but it's really hard to get through because it's overgrown. It's easier just to stick to the paved roads. As the base 100th anniversary was coming up, it was also the anniversary for Vimy coming up. So they canvassed the troops for ideas for what can we do to, you know, for the base for its 100th centenary. So somebody happened to mention there was training trenches that were still out in the training area, and they ended up getting a group of 8 or 9 engineers from the militia, and they actually went in there and redug the trench section that's closest to the old main gate road. There's like the main gate road, then there's the original main gate road, which runs parallel. So you can't get to it from outside the base, but you can get to it from inside the base. But it's still all paved because it's, you know, pavement from the 1920s and 30s. So anyways, these young fellas went in there that one summer and dug piece of the support trench that was there. So the reason why they picked that part though is because it's roadway and you can get a bus in there. So if you're ever on a bus tour up that way, that's also a way to get in. You can drive right up to it. So since then, we've been holding our annual Vimy service every morning on 9th of April, first thing in the morning. And it's still pretty chilly because I don't see any snow in any of those. Yeah, I went on right to see some snow. So, and we've had a lot of dignitaries and stuff come to see it now because Vimy was coming up for the 100th and these were the training trenches the original ones. So, the fellow that's on the bottom left there in the photograph is the mayor of Arras. So he's the mayor of the city that's right next to the Vimy Ridge. And there'll be a little bit more about that in a second. So part of the 100th anniversary, one of the first events we did that year was what they said, breakfast in the trenches, and it was held with all the former base commanders and base chief warrant officers and some of the unit commanders. And so anyways, so they did a little vignette that they did for the whole year's history. And so I supplied the kit so we could do a little bit of a reenactment, but it's not reenactment if you're really soldiers, it's just period dress. These guys are really soldiers, not pretending. We also created what's called Legacy Park. This is at the front gate of the base now. So originally the front gate didn't have anything. It was just like a little stone thing that said, "Welcome to CP Borden." And that was about it. There was nothing, none of the gates are named. Whereas if you go to every other military base, it's like if you go, for example, Kingston, they got 2 gates, Vimy Gate and McNaughton Gate, right? So here, Borden didn't have any of the gates named, so we had a long talk, and I was friends with the base chief who was in the last picture, and he said, well, maybe we can do something like a gate guard duty thing. So anyways, this is what they came up with. I remember what the name of the lady was now. I did the research into the park. So I didn't build the park, I didn't design the park, but I did the research into it. So what you're looking at is, normally at a base, there's a gate that you can actually open and close physically back in the old days, right? And they always play tattoo to say the gates are closing, and then last post when the sentries are put closed, and bang, gates closed for the night. If you're outside the gates, and you were supposed to be on the inside of the gate, you're AWOL, right? So that's basically what that's all about. So troops march in, troops march out. When you're going off to war, you leave, right? So basically the black wall there is representing the gate, the actual, you see the opening in it, you see? And then there's a bugler statue up there, and basically it's to call them home again, because you saw the words for last post are come home, come home. Last post is calling for you to hear, right? So basically the bugler is calling everybody that's ever left the base to come back in again. They built a pathway, so if you go park at that park, you can actually walk through the pathway over to the restored trenches. It's a nice little walk through there. Just make sure you bring your butt juice if you're going in July. Okay. They also took that old main gate road that you can see running on where that blue dot is, basically, and they renamed it to Canadian Expeditionary Force Road. And the trail is now called Freedom Trail. There's 2 urns. There's one urn that's actually in the wall, which you can see up on the upper right. There's a second urn that's buried down at their cenotaph, because the 157th, being the first guys, are the ones that marched there, and then the ones that went off again. So that was the main road that they marched to from Barrie, where the railway head used to be, all the way into where Borden was. So in those urns is the earth from Vimy. So they will politically say nicely that it contains the DNA of fallen soldiers, right? So that's not what they're saying, but that's, we have to say that right now. So it contains the DNA of the fallen soldiers. So both of these urns are filled with earth. So the shape of that park has got to do with the way the parade square is. For us, a parade square is something sacred, right? You don't saunter through the middle of a parade square. You always march around the outside because it is considered hallowed ground. It's considered hollow ground because after the battle, the troops would fall into a hollow square, 4 companies around the center, where they would lay all the fallen that they could find, right? The ground would become soaked with the DNA of the fallen soldiers, right? That's usually where they put the rock cairns to mark where the battle was, because normally, back in those days, they didn't bring you home. They buried you either in a mass grave, or if they were lucky, you could get an individual grave, right? And those cairns were there to mark the graves. So basically, this is all going back to that whole concept of we want to make sure that our fallen are recognized and brought home, especially the ones that have no known grave, because the artillery was so brutal that some of the guys were basically dissipated into the wind. There's 2 bugler statues. There's one at the front gate, and there's a twin that's at Arras now at Vimy. Marlene Hilton, that's the one I was trying to remember the name, sorry. So, the bugler may look familiar, however, she stretched the legs and changed the face. So my buddies were looking at it from the back and they said, oh no, actually, because shoulders. But because I'm not built like the, you know, monuments. But anyways, the whole purpose is they want to make sure that everybody's called home again. And this is the last one. The base chaplain at the time, Major Michael Allen, he ended up making these stained glass windows himself. And yeah, I'm in it again too. Because I was the only guy that had the uniforms. So they've had to change my skin color. They're all the same height, you notice. Yeah. Oh, except for the Mountie, sorry, because I think his son is wearing his grandfather's uniform. So the Mounties there for a reason. There were Mounties at Vimy Ridge because they were the military police. They had raised troops themselves to send overseas. So back then, those were our 4 services other than the Merchant Marine. Right? And that should be it. Oh, and a little Easter egg for anybody that watches the movies and knows who Wolverine is. If you look at the attestation paper on the right, because he was also supposed to have fought at D-Day too. Yeah. So the name, I don't know if you can see it, is James Howlett. Yeah, from Cold Lake, Alberta, right? So if you ever watched the Marvel Comics movie series, yeah, that's where he's supposed to be originally from, is from Cold Lake, Alberta. And he was a sergeant in the Canadian Army before he went through all his metamorphosis and all that stuff. So he fought at Vimy, he's supposed to have fought at D-Day. So that's a little Easter egg. This artwork is from one of the kids that entered it for my Legion in Victoria Harbour. So it was one of the ones that had actually won an award that year. It was pretty fitting that, you know, through the eyes of the kids, this is how they see what it was like 100 years ago and change now. Okay. Anyways, that's it. So. Any questions quick here? Or does everybody want to get to the refreshments first? I'm going to stay here. I'm going to stay with all the kit. If you got any questions, I'll be up here. And Justin.
Can I ask a question now?
Sure.
What we sometimes call the tin hat,
Yes.
just the flat structure. Even back then, the Americans would have a better,
They had the same helmet?
more coverage.
No.
What about the Canadian Army now?
Canadian Army, we're wearing Kevlar now. Kevlar. It's like a plastic, only it's layered and layered and layered with fiberglass. During D-Day, we had come up with the D-Day helmet, which is basically a turtle shell. So if you look at the profile on this one, compared to this one, there's a heck of a lot more coverage on the back of your head, right? So the problem is those M1 helmets the Americans were wearing during World War II. I wore them in the Army in the 60s, 70s, sorry, in the 70s, 80s, and the original harnesses inside of them used to pull back all the time. So I've actually got 2 compressed discs that I'm not getting rid of. and it's from those helmets, because they always pull backwards out. So they did change the helmet liners in them a bit, and they went to what they call the jump helmet liner. The jump helmet liner was like a 4-point attachment on the inside, and held it square on your head. So it was more tilted forward, so the weight was more balanced on your head. So all these changes in the kit are all coming from people getting hurt mostly. Right? And it took a long time. And there's somebody's asking me about the rumor about are Canadians buying their own helmets over in Latvia right now, right? So Canadian Army has always been very good at finding other resources to do the job they need to have done. So supposed to wear on parade, you have to wear the Queen's issue. That's what KIT stands for. That's actually, well, King's issue now. KIT, King's issue and trust. Right? So you're wearing your full kit and caboodle, right? But it has to be what you were issued when you're on parade. However, in the field, they're making a lot more exceptions to what you're wearing in the field nowadays. And even then, when you're looking at the guys in battle there, they're not wearing their parade uniform the whole time while they're getting shot at and living in the muck and everything else. They've already started, people were knitting them socks from the ladies' auxiliaries and all that stuff back home, like the Red Cross and the church groups and stuff like that, right? And they were getting sweaters and all sorts of things that they could put underneath the kit that they were wearing. Because this stuff is okay, but it's not the best. And especially if you're wearing something that's organic in a place that like basically rots everything organic, right? So that's why we've gone to synthetics now, because the synthetics hold up a lot better. We had a version of, for D-Day, there was actually a canvas type web. So basically what we call a tactical vest nowadays, right? So these old style webbing had braces on them, like suspenders on it. Any of this stuff you can touch because it's not the museum. So all that weight with all that ammunition and everything. And now by this point, by World War II, we're carrying extra ammunition for machine guns. So it's not just your own ammunition, it's also the other gunner's ammunition. Because he can't carry all of that himself. Right? So they spread the weight amongst all the troops. So even just this empty is already probably about 10, 15 pounds. Yeah, he was the first Canadian division commander, and then they made it after the Canadian Corps commander. So first it was Byng, and then Curry came along afterwards. So Byng was the British one, and Curry was the...
But was he not one who was most instrumental in getting it changed and
yeah,
recognized?
Between him and McDonald, again, the general of the artillery. So those guys were brainstorming, like literally brainstorming. But Curry didn't have the same reputation because he had to make the difficult decisions on which troops are going into where. So they still had some disparaging names for him after the fact because of the losses. But the losses weren't as great as they would have been if they'd been under the other guys. So the problem with leadership is you got to make difficult choices sometimes.
Yeah, I've read stories about where he was the hero.
Yeah.
And other countries treated him as a hero.
Yeah.
And in Canada, he was treated like a piece of crap.
Now in Canada, we treat any of our heroes like that.
That's
Oh, it's like, oh, you're getting pretty good, eh? You're getting pretty good. Don't get too big. Yeah.
My wife says we eat our own.
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, that's true. The whole thing about this is you got to do the research. So if you really want to know, there's all sorts of resources out there. Just remember, some were written by the the government that was in power at the time. Some were written by the ones that were trying to get re-elected. They had to have an election during the war. That was pretty hard, right? And then influenza comes along after, and all the rest of that stuff. So there's a lot of things in our history that we've pretty much forgotten nowadays. A lot of people got home, nobody wanted to talk about it because the guys that were shot up didn't want to talk about it. Nobody wanted to look at them because they had all these terrible wounds, missing legs, and pieces of fixed ankles. You know what I mean? So even our wounded coming back these days, people like, well, you don't look that wounded. Yeah. And just for the record, I am a soldier with PTSD. I served in Cambodia in '92 with the UN, and I was in Bosnia in '99 during the Serbian bombing campaign when they're flying out of Aviano. So I had the front row seat for all that. It was pretty cool. Killing fields are real, so just because they stopped doing it during the war doesn't mean that they didn't stop doing it to people. There are still countries around the world that they're doing it right now. So you gotta take the news sources where they're coming from.
And my wife, she has PTSD. She was a correctional officer, which are, they're the forgotten responders.
No, I understand. Yeah.
Right, because it's the police, the ambulance, paramedics, with
Yeah.
correctional.
All the emergency
officers
services.
are all three, and they're very much collectors of society. And, you know, the last straw was when she watched her woman take her intestines out of her stomach. That was it.
Yeah. Yes, Matt.
My father-in-law signed up with the Dr. Sutherland Highlanders, I believe they were called, from Embro. You mentioned Brant and Oxford,
Yeah.
but you didn't mention that. Were they part of the English then? Dr. Sutherland? Highlanders from Embro.
Oh, Argyle and Sutherlands are out of Brampton.
Oh, he was from Embro,
Yeah. Well,
Dr. Sutherland.
yeah, but wherever okay, so it wasn't his battalion.
Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't Mr. Sutherland's battalion. It was named after the Argyle and Sutherland Scottish Regiment. So
Okay,
in
yeah,
Canada, we did repeat a lot of names, like the Black Watch Royal Highland Regiment in Canada. There's also the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders. There's the, what was it? Where I grew up was Essex Scottish, and then it was Essex and Kent Scottish because they amalgamated the regiments. So every place where we live around here, they've taken the regiments from the early days, like the Brants, and then they became the Dufferin Rifles, and then they became, I think they're 56th Field right now, officially on paper, right? Which is artillery. So
And did they not go to war in a kilt?
a lot of the battalions, yeah, you see at the very beginning of the first Canadian Division's landing in France, and they were wearing their kilts. They went to battle in the kilts. The Toronto Scottish, they got a khaki colored kilt cover they were wearing. They were still wearing their kilts with all the rats and the lice and all that. Not getting rid of Yay, rubber Scots, we can do that. So, yeah, that's nothing, just to see the sheep. So, I'm part Scottish, I can say this. So, yeah.
When did you start all your research? Like, after you retired, or have you been doing this research?
It's generational.
Okay.
Yeah. So I started because my dad would take us on trips, and I visited pretty well every fort on the eastern seaboard of Canada and most of the U.S. going down to Florida. So understanding the technology now is different. So my dad was an armor's mate in the Navy, and then he was later commander in the Navy Reserve. My mom was a radar control room operator. So if you take a gunner and a radar technician or operator and put them together, you get fire control systems. That's it. That's what I did. Did, I should say. So then I taught at Vimy school for 2 years at Regimental Company, which is where we teach the basic, the soldiering part of our core training. So first you learn how to do recruit training, and then you learn your elemental training, so like how to your basic soldiering or basic seamanship, basic air stuff, fueling, all that kind of stuff. And then they move you on into whatever your specific corps in your army is, and they teach you the basic tactics of how your corps operates in the field. So first they teach you at the platoon and company level, and then as you get senior in your ranks, then they teach you at the next level up, so the company brigade. So that way we know how to take our troops and sight them in the field, know how to do all the camouflage, because trying to park 50 trucks in the field and hide them is not easy, right? And get all your all-around defenses all set up and everything else, right? So there's...
When people join the military, say now, when do you decide if you're going to be Navy, Army, Air Force? Like, do they all just go in, do basic training, and then kind of branch off to what they
A lot of the trades you can choose right away, but some of the trades, it depends on what their manning is. Some of them is like what color uniform you want. So it's color, whatever's in vogue that day, I guess. So for me, I went with the Vimy Corps of Vimy. Okay, so I'll have to explain that too. It's Corps of Vimy, so Corps of Royal Canadian Electromechanical Engineers. So that means that every single engineer in that corps is royal, one of the Queen's Royal Engineers. Not, the corps itself is not royal, it's, each troop is royal, because we all work for the Queen. Well, back then it was the Queen, now it's the King. So If you understand the difference in the concept. So it's not like if it was Bob's store or Bob's store's employees, right? So the employees would be the royal part, not the store, the title of the company. Yeah. Yes?
Don't see many boots and shoes nowadays with the lacing across like this.
Yeah,
Usually it's crisscross.
right.
Is this peculiar to the First and Second World War, or
Oh.
here to the same?
Cut with a knife, you get it off quicker. It's easy to get it off. It's easy to get it off with a knife,
Yes,
right?
so it's
When you
still,
start cross-lacing, it's harder. But the way we cross-lace them today, compared to the old days, is we cross-lace big toe up first, all the way to the top, and then the outside toe all the way up to the top. So that way you can still cut the bottom and pull them out. But if you have them all crisscrossed any way you want, they get all tangled up.
My cousin,
Yeah.
he was a tank commander in World War II, with Canadians. And he told me one story that they pulled over at the side of the road, stayed in the ditch, and then he's laying there, kind of sitting laying. Next thing he knows, something's feeling his boots. And he says, I just froze. And he says, didn't move. Didn't even open my eyes. I knew who they were. And they were Germans.
Oh,
And he's what they're looking for is because the Germans crossed their laces.
yeah,
And
that was another thing, yeah.
if my laces were crossed, I would have been dead. Because the one story was that they would go in and the Germans cut the head off of every other guy and put it in his lap.
Hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, he said that was,
But the story with the Gurkhas is true, that he did actually,
Yeah,
that's how they would find.
they were.
The guy got good. Okay, so it's probably time to hydrate so we don't have a riot. Right? So I would think, yeah, so like they said, we're back and I'm up here for show and tell.
Thank you very much.
Okay.